Yeah, I think I can start now. Yeah. Please take your seats. We shall start. Okay.
Maybe you should give a gesture that because many people don't have the headphones and they won't hear anything.
So what should I do?
I'm
Yes.
showing them.
Take your headphones, please. Maybe you will hear me better.
Anna, can you remind them to put this on? She's making the round to tell them.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm starting.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, before we start our meeting, I would like to remind you that our meeting is being recorded and live streamed on our website. Please know that we have 33 speakers signed up on the speakers list for the discussion of the agenda number 7. As you have all previously been informed by the table office, the list of those wishing to take the floor in the debate was formally closed 1 hour ago. Due to very high interest and our limited time available, all debate participants are requested to limit their intervention only to 2 minutes. Please also be informed that the floor will be opened for the interventions by members only, and I strictly repeat, for all interventions after the conclusion of agenda item 7. I ask everyone who intervenes to please pay attention to the timer, which will be visible on the screens. This will help ensure that we can all engage in the discussion and you will show your respect to all members of the committee. Dear colleagues, I call the Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions to order. As you have seen, the agenda for our meeting has been circulated. I understand that many of us may wish to address the recent developments, which I believe can be done within the framework of our planned agenda. Please also let me inform you that we have a slight change in our agenda, and Special Representative Cohen had to unfortunately cancel his participation. So now, can we adopt the agenda?
Point of order, we would like to speak.
Okay, I can see. Are you objecting the agenda?
Yes.
Okay, so now I give you a floor for 1 minute.
Мы настаиваем на исключении пункта 7а. Вы пригласили к участию в официальном мероприятии лицо, которое обвиняется в создании экстремистского формирования с целью захвата государственной власти неконституционным путем. Это решение превращает официальное мероприятие Ассамблеи в сомнительную политическую акцию, по сути направленную против полноправного государства члена Ассамблеи. Предоставление трибуны Ассамблеи антиправительственным силам, ставящим своей целью дестабилизацию обстановки в государствах-участниках, дискредитирует парламентскую ассамблею как форума, уважающего суверенные права его членов, как форума, который в прошлом претендовал на статус площадки для цивилизованного обмена мнениями. В этой связи белорусская делегация заявляет решительный протест и просит
Okay,
снять
now I will
данный
have to
пункт.
interrupt you. The 1 minute time limit is over. So thank you for the objections, and now we will proceed to vote. Now we'll vote whether to adopt the agenda by show of hands. A simple majority is needed to adopt the agenda. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Thank you. All those opposed, please raise your hands. Thank you. There is a clear majority in favor, so the agenda is adopted in line with Rule 33.
Мы вынуждены
With
покинуть
that, I will move to
заседание.
the agenda number 2. So, let me now present you some opening remarks. Dear colleagues, as we gather here in Vienna today, we bear witness to deeply concerning trends wherein fundamental freedoms face growing threats and democratic standards and institutions are eroding in many parts of the OSCE region. I cannot possibly start today's meeting without mentioning one name: Alexei Navalny. Born on June 4, 1976, murdered on February 16, 2024, by the Putin regime and Russian authorities in a prison in Siberia. Personally, and on behalf of our entire committee, I would like to express my deepest condolences to his wife Julia, his children, and family. Navalny liked to quote a well-known phrase of unknown authorship: "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." It reminds me of a quote of Václav Havel, the former president of the Czech Republic. Indifference to others and to the fate of whole community is exactly what opens the door to the evil. Colleagues, the door of evil is already wide open, and it will require monumental efforts, courage, and patience from all of us to be able to resist this evil together and to fight it. Navalny's murder is a tragic reminder of the paramount challenges we are facing. Please allow me to highlight just a few. The space for civil society and independent media is rapidly diminishing, and perpetuating prejudice and discrimination hinder full and equal participation of many in our societies. Protesters, human rights defenders, journalists, and dissenting voices persistently face threats, violence, and wrongful imprisonment. Instances of ill treatment, violence, and pushbacks of migrants, in some cases leading to tragic loss of life, continue to be recurrent. The targeted killings of civilians, unlawful detentions, abductions, large-scale deportations, and sexual violence perpetrated by the Russian Federation in Ukraine are both shocking and gross violation of international humanitarian law. In our capacity as the leadership of this committee, alongside with my dear colleagues, Vice Chairs Sargis Kandanian and Rapporteur Malik Ben Ashur, who I want to sincerely thank for the cooperation, we remain dedicated to shedding light on the most pressing human rights issues in the OSCE region. Our commitment translates into issuing statements and communications on thematic or local issues and engaging in in-person interactions to further promote our OSCE-PA work. We will continue to actively collaborate with OSCE executive structures and relevant external partners, and most importantly, foster and strengthen dialogue with civil society organizations and human rights defenders. Reflecting on the past year, for instance, I had the opportunity of participating in the OSCE's Human Dimension Conference in Warsaw, which allowed me to engage in open dialogue with numerous human rights defenders, analysts, and representatives of OSCE participating states. I always find it extremely beneficial to not only to hear official narratives, but also those of opponents, and the voice of the community and organizations that are often kicked in the ankles, and in too many instances face threats by their own governments. Additionally, I addressed the OSCE Human Dimension Committee in Vienna in December, and I was able to hold fruitful discussions with Committee Chair Ambassador Kalan, Audio Director Mr. Mekachi, and OSCE Representative for Freedom of the Media, Madame Ribeiro, all of whom join us in today's committee meeting. These efforts facilitate constructive exchanges, which hopefully instigate positive changes, a responsibility we must uphold as lawmakers in the face of persistent and grievous human rights challenges. This is a never-ending job, so we have to celebrate even the small successes. Dear colleagues, mindful of our limited time today, please rest assured that we will actively continue working on priority human rights topics on behalf of our committee. So now let us proceed to the agenda number 3. Our reporter, Mr. Malik Ben Ashur from Belgium, who was elected in Vancouver in July 2023, will now present a preliminary overview of his intentions regarding his forthcoming report for the 2024 annual session in Bucharest. I very much look forward to seeing the report in the coming months. So now, Malik, please have a floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Dear colleagues, as we meet today to address human rights challenges in the OSCE region, it is vital that we confront these issues with a renewed dedication to the principle in the Helsinki Final Act. The acknowledgement of the universality of human rights and fundamental freedoms is the foundation of our organization and a precondition for regional security. The events of the past year serve as a reminder of the urgent need for our collective action to safeguard fundamental freedoms and rights. Armed conflicts, violence, political repression, discrimination and racism, and the disregard for human life and human dignity continue to severely undermine this principle across the OSCE region and beyond. Today's meeting provides us with an important opportunity to engage in a thoughtful discussion on the most pressing human rights concerns. Prioritizing among the many challenges is certainly not a simple task. However, I would like to draw the committee's attention to a set of issues that I consider particularly crucial for discussion and that I plan to focus on in my upcoming report and resolution. Foremost among these is the ongoing situation in Ukraine, which demands our continued attention and support. In just a few days, on February 24, we will mark 2 years since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. The targeted killings of civilians, torture, arbitrary detentions, enforced disappearances, sexual violence, and attacks on civilian infrastructures and property by Russian Federation forces have led to a perpetual crisis and unspeakable human suffering. We must continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine, firmly condemn ongoing violations of international humanitarian law, and further explore avenues for accountability for the atrocities committed against civilians. The plight of millions of refugees and forcibly displaced persons from Ukraine requires undivided attention. And yet, migration and forced displacement are not confined to Ukraine. The escalating global refugee crisis demands coordinated efforts to ensure the protection and dignified living conditions for refugees, particularly the most vulnerable ones. Human trafficking and other forms of exploitation, including conflict zones, pose grave threats necessitating initiatives to combat these heinous practices. Challenges persist along the Mediterranean, the Balkan route, and the Eastern European border. In addition to these critical situations, the military action of Azerbaijan in September last year has had a lasting impact on the region. While some internally displaced persons will now have the chance to return to their homes for the first time in decades, over 100,000 displaced Karabakh Armenians have arrived as refugees in Armenia during September last year. These refugees required humanitarian support, and their right of return to their homes should be addressed, including adequate guarantees of protection. In this context, we must commit to supporting a sustainable peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Another issue I want to stress is the alarming rise of attacks against journalists and whistleblowers and attempts to suppress press freedom in our region. Journalists are increasingly becoming targets: online harassment, physical attacks, legal intimidation, targeted surveillance, and even deadly violence. The infringement upon the basic rights to freedom of speech not only hinders the dissemination of accurate information, but also undermines the crucial role of journalists as watchdogs, holding those in power accountable. The violent crackdowns of independent journalism in Belarus and the Russian Federation are particularly worrisome, which is why we must double our effort to ensure the safety of journalists, uphold the principles of a free press, and reinforce the right to access and disseminate information without fear of reprisal. Recurring incidents of police violence, in many instances fatal, remain a cause for great concern. Police violence is a phenomenon that can be observed across many institutional cultures, employing excessive force of disproportionate use of force in different parts of the OSCE region. As parliamentarians, we must work towards establishing more robust oversight mechanisms and legal frameworks aimed at ensuring accountability for human rights abuses committed by law enforcement officials. We must also underscore the commitment to safeguarding justice and upholding fundamental human rights principles. On another note, why the Israel-Hamas conflict does not fall within the OSCE region, we cannot ignore the deepening humanitarian crisis in Gaza. While potential security threats and the possible spillover effect emanating from the crisis are better placed to be discussed in our first committee, we must acknowledge the catastrophic impact the conflict has had on civilians, particularly women and children. I must also stress the first ruling of the International Court of Justice, which found it plausible that Israel has committed acts of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. It goes without saying that the unfolding events in the Middle East demand our continued attention. The October 7 terrorist attacks committed by Hamas must be condemned in the strongest possible terms, and I encourage all of us to continue to advocate for the immediate release of all hostages and all Palestinian prisoners arbitrarily detained, as well as unimpeded access of humanitarian aid into Gaza and the full cessation of hostilities. This leads me to the final point I want to highlight today. Human rights demand the rejection of any double standards or inconsistencies to safeguard these fundamental principles. Only by exhibiting unwavering dedication to the values we champion, consistently and without exception, can we make the OSCE region more just and more secure. As as representatives elected by the people, it is our duty to safeguard the dignity and freedom of all people and actively contribute to societies where human rights can flourish. Dear colleagues, the challenges before us are immense, but our commitment to human rights can pave the way for positive change. I'm looking forward to hearing your insights and suggestions as we navigate these complex issues together. Thank you very much for your attention.
No, thank you, Malik. Let us proceed to the next agenda item to hear the insights, particularly on how we can mobilize our organization to effectively address human rights issues from the OSCE officials presented here today. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm now pleased to introduce Matteo Meccacci, an old friend of the OSCE and former chair of this committee. A former member of the parliament in Italy and longtime activist in a number of human rights areas, I warmly welcome you back to the OSCE as the director of the OSCE's human rights body. As you know, we greatly appreciate the close cooperation we continue to enjoy with your office, both at the leadership and staff level, particularly in the field of election observation activities. Mr. Meccacci, you have the floor, and I ask you to please keep your comments to some 5 to 7 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson, for the warm welcome, and thank you to all of you for the invitation, members of Parliament, friends of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Let me also start by expressing my thanks to President Comm and to Chairperson Potukova and the Secretariat for the invitation to participate and to address the third committee today. Sadly, in 2 days, we are about to mark the second year since the start of the military attack in Ukraine by the Russian Federation, and the immense humanitarian crisis is still unraveling. The widespread violence and violation of human rights we continue to witness in Ukraine is only growing louder as time passes, urging us to remain resolute in offering our contribution towards an immediate end of the hostilities and to assure accountability for the violations we have witnessed. At the same time, as we continue to concentrate our efforts on Ukraine, we are also seeing human rights and democracy increasingly under pressure across the OSCE region, including in the Russian Federation. In this sense, I wish to commend the focus of today's discussion on the topic of political dissidents and political prisoners, as well as the leadership of the Parliamentary Assembly by Representative Steve Cohen, a special representative on this issue. The tragic death of Alexei Navalny in prison last Friday followed years of unjust imprisonment and the denial of a fair trial. ODIHR has called on the Russian authorities to launch an immediate and credible investigation into the circumstances in which Mr. Navalny died, allowing his representatives full access to it. At the same time, we continue to call for the release of any other opposition politician merely for expressing their political views in the entire OSCE region. Human rights violations are connected to the undermining of our democracies, and this is an issue that warrants more attention. As we witnessed, repression of political opponents is not an issue only of the past, of the early years of the Helsinki process, but remains a reality in our region. With this in mind, allow me to share a brief reflection on what we think is a crucial aspect of this discussion, and that is the subject of human rights defenders and their role in our democratic societies and public life. On the one hand, human rights defenders are not political actors, and they should not be considered as such. Rather, they perform important and legitimate functions in democratic societies by working to ensure the states fully respect human rights, fundamental freedoms, democracy, and the rule of law. Nevertheless, in society where restrictions of rights and fundamental freedoms become, unfortunately, institutional practices, human rights defenders are increasingly and regrettably seen as political opponents for their dissents, their criticism, and their legitimate and non-political human rights work. Unfortunately, the more states depart from democratic practices, the more pressure against human rights defenders increases. As we document through our work at ODIHR, this can manifest in a variety of ways and degrees, and it is unfortunately a long list, with spurious lawsuits aiming to harass human rights activists, with the introduction of so-called foreign agent legislation to stigmatize defenders, with the withdrawing of funding, with the recriminalization of defamation, or indeed, in the most extreme cases, through imprisonment, torture, or enforced disappearances. The court judgment against Oleg Orlov, a human rights defender and the chairman of the Board of Human Rights Center's Memorial in the Russian Federation, which is expected to be published next Monday, is deeply worrying and symbolic of such environment for human rights and democracy work. As you all well know, this pressure often forces human rights defenders into self-censorship, depriving our democratic public life of critical voices, which are essential. That is why recognizing and addressing the specific challenges faced by defenders is essential for the international community and all actors committed to the protection of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, ODIHR works on the situation of human rights defenders and with human rights defenders in a variety of ways. Let me mention a few snapshots of our work in this area, as I believe a closer cooperation with you, as both Parliamentary Assembly members and members of your national parliaments, could reinforce both our efforts. First, ODIHR's guidelines on the protection of human rights defenders remains a leading international document available in 11 languages, supporting your countries to advance the protections of human rights defenders. This year we will begin the process of updating this guideline adopted in 2014. In this regard, we will strongly welcome consultation with your parliaments and relevant national institutions as to better reflect and address new challenges that defenders are facing in the OSCE region. Second, we continue to monitor the situation of human rights defenders and the challenges they face. Through dedicated cycles of assessment, ODIHR examines situation of defenders in selected OSCE countries in the context of their legal and political obligations, examining trends, challenges, and good practices, and producing recommendations for all participating states. At the same time, we at ODIHR have been taking a closer look into the situation of human rights defenders who can no longer work safely in their home countries. Last year, ODIHR spoke to more than 100 defenders who relocated from Belarus to other countries. Prior to fleeing their home, some of them were detained, threatened, ill-treated, had their offices raided, and organizations closed by authorities. And this was done as a result of their legitimate and important human rights work. Others saw this happening to their colleagues and friends and had good reasons to fear that they themselves were next in line. They now continue their human rights work in exile while navigating personal, legal, and organizational challenges. Allow me at this point to recall the deteriorating situation of human rights in Belarus, where since 2020, dozens of human rights defenders have been arbitrarily detained, while many remain in prison in deplorable conditions with instances of torture and other ill treatment. It is just from hours ago the terrible news of the death of Ilhar Lednik, a 64-year-old journalist in detention for a critical article against the country's president. ODIHR has in the past been able to monitor trials of similar cases in Belarus. And despite our attempts to offer this assistance to Belarus in the past years, there has been no positive feedback. So, as the crackdown continues, and with elections, as you know, scheduled for the coming Sunday, and for which no invitation to observe has been extended either to ODIHR or to the Parliamentary Assembly, we must call once again on the Belarusian authorities to respect the rights of human rights defenders and of all citizens, including domestic election observers, which will be active this Sunday. Lastly, allow me to mention the work we regularly do to increase skills and knowledge of human rights defenders. As the demand for them keeps growing, we maintain a leading online platform called freedomlab.io, where defenders can find all our tools and trainings. I would invite all of you to explore this website, and thank you for promoting it among your contacts. Ladies and gentlemen, defending the right to participate and contribute to our democratic and political processes remain essentials to ensure the respect and upholding of human rights. Nobody understands this better than you, as parliamentary representatives and politicians. Be it by shedding light on the situation of political dissidents, prisoners, or by protecting the work of human rights defenders, we must unite our forces and voices. Indeed, our partnership remains crucial for upholding OSCE commitments and democratic principles. As always, I look forward to continue working closely with you, with the Third General Committee this year, as we advocate for security in our region, grounded on human rights, democratic elections, tolerance, and equality. Thank you once again for your attention, and look forward to hearing discussions and the reflections.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Not only for your intervention, but also for your work that you do in the field of human rights and rule of law protection. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mrs. Teresa Ribeiro, the OSCE representative on freedom of the media. Ms. Ribeiro's work in advocating for journalists' rights and advanced policies upholding the fundamental tenets of freedom of expression across the OSCE region underscores the indispensable role that free and vibrant media plays in fostering democratic societies. Dear Mrs. Ribeiro, I am proud of the excellent cooperation that OSCE-PA enjoys with our office under your leadership, and I also wish to take this occasion to thank you once more for the successful side event on the safety of journalists that we co-hosted earlier. The floor is yours, Teresa.
Thank you very much, Lucy. In 2 days, we will mark the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of the sovereign state of Ukraine by the Russian Federation, a sad commemoration of Europe's return to being a dark continent, so eloquently described by Mark Mazauer in his thought-provoking study of the 20th century history of Europe. 2 years of immense human suffering, of insane destruction, and of attacks on our common values and freedoms, including on media freedom. Allow me to use this opportunity to pay tribute to all journalists that bravely carry out their crucial work in these terrible conditions. Dear Excellencies, dear members of the General Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions, thank you for having me today in this important session. Last week, we heard the terrible news of the death of Alexei Navalny, Russian President Putin's main opponent. Navalny spoke publicly on what he saw in his country. He made use of his human right to freedom of expression. It turned out to be fatal. He died in a faraway prison at the age of 47. 2 weeks ago, Russian President Putin, in an interview, stated to believe that a deal can be reached to free Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich, who has been detained for almost a year in Russia on accusation of espionage. If reciprocal steps were to be taken, the president stated, an agreement on Mr. Gershkovich's release could be reached, hinting on a prisoner exchange with 2 Russians held captive in the US. With this, the Russian president reduced a journalist into a bargaining chip. Dear Excellencies, we are experiencing very difficult times in our common region, facing many developments that threaten our common security and our democracies. In a time marked by unprecedented challenges and with populism on the rise, the role of those who speak up against power The watchdogs of our democracy is under threat and media freedom is endangered. The working environment for public voices all over the world, including in the OSCE area, has been negatively impacted by the misuse of media by autocratic and populist political leaders, and the sharp increase in anti-media rhetoric, including verbal attacks, insults, and accusation of disseminating fake news, as well as online threats and hate speech. These days, we find ourselves at the crossroads. To preserve our democracies and our freedoms, we have to find ways to navigate through this rocky terrain so that we can continue to safeguard freedom of expression and media freedom, now and in the years to come. This was, is, and will be key to our comprehensive security. Therefore, we must stand in solidarity with those who are facing threats, intimidation, and violence simply for speaking truth to power. We must reject the politics of division and fear that seeks to undermine the very foundations of our democracy. Quality journalism, so vital to our security and freedoms, is about establishing facts, informing the public on matters of public interest, holding those in power accountable, and giving voice to the voiceless. Beyond their role in preserving democratic norms, journalists play a pivotal role in promoting security. A free and independent press serves as an early warning system, alerting society to emerging threats. Whether it's uncovering patterns of criminal activity, exposing extremist ideologies, or shedding light on potential health crises, journalists play a critical role in informing the public and enabling policymakers to take proactive measures to mitigate risks. Secondly, media freedom is essential for fostering social cohesion and resilience. By providing a platform for diverse voices and perspectives, journalists help to bridge divides, build understanding, and promote dialogue within society. This not only strengthens the fabric of our societies, but also reduces the likelihood of conflict and instability by addressing grievances and promoting inclusivity. Furthermore, a free press acts as a safeguard against misinformation and disinformation, which can be exploited by hostile actors to sow discord, undermine trust in institutions, and manipulate public opinion. By upholding rigorous standards of accuracy, fairness, and impartiality, journalists can help to inoculate society against the corrosive effects of propaganda and falsehoods, thereby bolstering our resilience to external threats and manipulation. All of the above are the exact reason why autocrats and populists scorn free and independent media. It is part of the populist strategy that thrives on misinformation, on distortion of the truth, on creating confusion about facts, on the pretension of simple answers to complex issues, on the belief in one strong leader who will fix it all. That is the exact reason why they want to silence journalists, to slander and to defame them, and ultimately to detain them. Unfortunately, many journalists in our region do not only face the threat of physical and online violence, but also have to fear a threat of arbitrary arrest and detention. In 2023, again, many journalists were jailed, fueled by the war, entrenched authoritarianism, and governments determined to silence dissenting voices and stifle media freedom. both inside and outside of their borders. Many of them are charged with terrorism-related and other serious offences without being properly informed of the charges against them or being able to exercise their basic judicial rights. Freedom of expression is not a privilege. It's a fundamental human right protected under Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and further elaborated upon in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. When journalists are imprisoned, not only are their individual rights violated, it threatens the very foundations of democracy. Furthermore, imprisoning journalists not only stifles the flow of information within a country, but also sends a chilling effect across borders. It undermines the international community's ability to access accurate and reliable news, hindering our collective efforts to address pressing challenges to our common security architecture, in frontal opposition to the principles, values, and ultimate goals of our organization. With the adoption of the OSCE Ministerial Council decision on the safety of journalists in 2018, the participating states committed to bring their laws, policies, and practices pertaining to media freedom fully in compliance with their international obligations and OSCE commitments, and to promote an environment for journalists where they can perform their work independently and without undue interference. The decision urges the release of arbitrarily detained journalists and recognizes the importance of investigative journalism. As part of the project on the safety of journalists that we launched in 2022, we are providing guidance on how to improve journalist safety across the OSCE region. Together with the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, and thank you, Lucy, we just hosted a joint side event where we enabled the exchange of national instruments and initiatives on journalist safety in the framework of our recently launched Safety of Journalists toolbox. Parliamentarians can play a crucial part in ensuring the safety of journalists and protecting the right to freedom of expression for everyone. It is upon us to defend and uphold the OSCE principles and commitments we adhere to support independent journalism and to resist efforts to silence dissenting voices or restrict media freedom. For in doing so, we are not only safeguard our democracy, but also enhance our common security. I count very much on your cooperation, and I look forward to today's discussion. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Teresa. And I'm pleased to welcome here Madam Ambassador Anne-Marie Callan to our committee. We look forward to hearing what plans you have for the Permanent Council's Human Dimension Committee. The committee you chair is effectively our committee's counterpart on the governmental side of the OSCE, which is why we are particularly eager to hear your input. We would appreciate if you could please keep your remarks to some 5 to 7 minutes. And now you have the floor, Madam Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Distinguished parliamentarians, thank you for the invitation to address you today in my capacity as Chair of the OSCE Human Dimension Committee. I would like to thank the Chairperson in Office Malta and the 2023 Chairperson in Office North Macedonia for their support. I would also like to thank all of our interlocutors, including the OSCE PA, and particularly Lucy Pochukova for her excellent and thought-provoking presentation on upholding international humanitarian and human rights law at the December Human Dimension Committee meeting. This Saturday marks the second anniversary of Russia's unprovoked, unjustifiable and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. For the past 2 years, we have witnessed the devastating and appalling human rights impacts of the war. The situation in Ukraine has and will continue to be at the forefront of our discussion at the Human Dimension Committee, whilst Russia continues to wage its illegal war of aggression against Ukraine. Last year, committee meetings focused on some of the most pressing and grave threats to human rights and fundamental freedoms of our region, such as conflict-related sexual violence, trafficking in human beings, the arrest and detention of journalists, the shrinking space for civil society, and violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. At the same time, there was a focus on issues requiring ongoing and persistent effort by participating states, such as Roma, Sinti and traveller rights, and political inclusion of persons with disabilities. We also highlighted issues such as the right to education in war, the mental health impacts of war, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly in the digital age. I'd like to draw your attention to 3 broad points that emerged from last year's Human Dimension Committee meetings. Firstly, Russia's actions in Ukraine, which are a grave breach of our shared human dimension commitments, have led to a dire human rights situation in Ukraine, and Ukraine will remain at the top of our agenda as long as Russia's illegal and brutal war of aggression continues. Secondly, gender inequality is a key factor and a root cause of the many issues discussed in the committee. Gender inequality is a threat to our collective security, and all OSCE participating states can do more to promote gender equality. Thirdly, civil society continues to play a vital role in promoting and protecting human rights. Their role includes providing emergency services, documenting human rights abuses, and supporting survivors of human rights violations. Civil society was represented at every thematic meeting at the Human Dimension Committee last year. On the topic of today's special debate, and following the tragic death of Alexei Navalny, I would like to echo the remarks made by Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ireland, Micheál Martin, who said, "His death underpins the lack of respect for the rule of law and protection of human rights in Russia, and is a reminder of the repressive nature of the regime against its own people." It is deeply worrying that 3 OSCE staff members employed by the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Dmytro Shabanov, Maxim Petrov and Vadim Golda, remain in detention. They have been separated from their families for over 22 months now. Let me renew our urgent call for their immediate and unconditional release. As a result of its illegal and brutal war of aggression in Ukraine, the number of those arbitrarily detained in Russia by Russia and its proxies continues to grow. Arbitrary detention violates many rights and will remain a focus of the work in the OSCE dimension this year, Human Dimension this year. A number of forms of arbitrary detention were discussed by the Human Dimension Committee last year. Arrest and detention of journalists, including citizen journalists, was a key issue. It is concerning that independent journalism is increasingly being criminalised in a number of OSCE participating states, forcing media actors to flee into exile. Recommended supports to journalists in exile include provision of visas and financial support to help them to continue their vital work. Participating states were also encouraged to take measures to combat disinformation, and we are very grateful to the OSCE Representative on Freedom of the Media, Teresa Ribeiro, for her contribution to our work. The committee also discussed threats faced by human rights defenders in the OSCE area, including arbitrary detention and forced exile. UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders Mary Lawler addressed the committee. She noted that over 25% of cases raised with states related to arbitrary detention, 20% to criminalisation, and 17% to intimidation, harassment or threats. Participating states were urged to accept the right of human rights defenders to carry out their important work and to put in place the necessary enabling legislation. At the December meeting on upholding international humanitarian and human rights law, The International Accountability Platform for Belarus outlined the gross human rights violations committed by Belarus in the run-up to the 2020 presidential election and its aftermath. They highlighted the need to maintain a historical record of human rights violations to help victims to seek redress. The situation for political prisoners in Belarus continues to be dire. As mentioned by ODIHR Director Mateo Makachi, tragically Ihar Lednik, a Belarusian political prisoner, died in prison this week. He's the 5th political prisoner to die in a Belarusian prison in less than 2 years. Madam Chair, in 2024, we look forward to working with the OSCE PA and other stakeholders, including OSCE committee chairs, the autonomous institutions, and I particularly want to thank ODIHR and Director McCatchy for the tremendous support for our work, but also field missions, other international organisations, academia and civil society, and we will work with them to advance the work of the Human Dimension Committee in 2024. The OSCE's comprehensive concept of security makes it clear that respect for human rights, the rule of law and democratic governance is a prerequisite for sustainable peace and security. During this challenging time of heightened regional conflict and global uncertainty, it is incumbent on all of us to implement our shared human dimension commitments and to shed light on the most serious human rights violations in our region. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Ambassador, and I look forward to continued close cooperation with you. Dear colleagues, we now turn to the discussion on the political dissidents and political prisoners. We have limited time, however, allow me to briefly emphasize the significance of why I incorporated this particular issue in today's agenda. Unfortunately, we are increasingly observing the surge of political dissidents and the alarming rise in the number of political prisoners in many parts of the OSCE region. Several participating states grapple with a growing trend of suppressing dissenting voices, leading to the imprisonment of individuals opposing government policies or advocating for political change. Colleagues, the prevalence of political dissidents and political prisoners in the OSCE region underscores the need for our continued scrutiny and engagement to uphold democratic standards and protect human rights enshrined in the Helsinki Final Act. Our Assembly has consistently devoted efforts to enhance effective political freedom throughout the OSCE region and to promote interparliamentary dialogue, to advocate for the release of political prisoners and prevent additional politically motivated imprisonment. Nonetheless, it has become more evident than ever that the fight for civil and political rights is far from over, and that their defense requires our vigilance and action. As lawmakers, we bear the responsibility of safeguarding and promoting freedom of speech and freedom of expression to foster environments where diverse political perspectives can contribute to the flourishing of democratic ideas. Dear members, in the spirit of our special debate, I want to also direct the attention of our committee to the urgent matter of the Russian Federation's unlawful detention of 3 members of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, Dmytro Shabanov, Vadim Golda, and Maxim Petrov. As you are aware, the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission operated as a field mission in Ukraine from 2014 until its discontinuation in 2022. The mission and its staff, including Dmytro Shabanov, Vadim Golda and Maxim Petrov, operated under a consensual mandate, one that was undeniably endorsed by the Russian Federation. Tragically, Dmytro Shabanov, Vadim Golda and Maxim Petrov, and I intentionally repeat these 3 names, have now endured unjust and illegal detention by the Russian Federation for a year and a half. Their families remain in the dark about the condition in which they are being held, which has led to over 670 days of continuous suffering endured by the detainees and their loved ones, a hardship that is unimaginable for all of us. While it is imperative that we continue to reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to fulfill its responsibilities as an OSCE participating state by immediately and unconditionally releasing all OSCE Special Monitoring Mission staff members, I urge each one of us as parliamentarians in this assembly to utilize our platform to keep the plight of the unlawfully detained Special Monitoring Mission staff at the forefront of our agenda. Let us exhaust all available avenues to support and facilitate their immediate release. With that in mind, I look forward to a meaningful and substantive discussion today and to amplifying our efforts and strengthening our overall work within this crucial field. Yes. I am now pleased to ask for remarks by Madam Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. After standing as a candidate in the 2020 Belarusian presidential elections, Madam Tikhanovskaya has played a pivotal role in advocating for democracy and human rights in Belarus as the leading opposition voice in exile. Mrs. Tikhanovskaya's unwavering commitment to fostering political change and her passionate advocacy positions her as a very important voice worth listening to as we delve into discussion on political dissidents and political prisoners today. Thank you much. Oh, yes. Thank you much for being here. Yes, I hope that. Yes, I can see you. I can see you now. Thank you very much for being here with us today, Madam Tikhanovskaya. We are looking forward to hearing your contribution, which I am sure will inform our subsequent discussion.
Madam Chair, distinguished members of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, it's great to be back to a circle of friends who cherish freedom, democracy, and rule of law. We all cherish the same values, and we here believe in peaceful, democratic, and prosperous Europe. And I am grateful to OSCE PA for your strong position in support of Ukraine and democratic Belarus. Both of our nations are fighting not only for our countries, but for the very values of Europe. Last week, as I was in Munich, I received the news of Alexei Navalny's death. And this Tuesday, we learned about the death of Igor Lednik, one of the leaders of Belarusian Social Democrats. Igor Lednik was imprisoned for his article criticizing the union state of Belarus and Russia, accusing Russia for violating the Budapest Memorandum and its international obligations. He believed that Russia is the main threat to peace in Europe, and for his position, he paid with his life. And these murders are a reminder that security, democracy, and human rights are interconnected. If the government abuses, tortures, and kills its own citizens, it will not respect its neighbors and international orders. These murders are also a reminder why we must do everything to support Ukraine's victory and those fighting for freedom in Belarus. Without the victory of Ukraine, there will not be free Belarus, but also vice versa. Without free Belarus, there will not be neither safe Ukraine nor peaceful Europe. Dear friends, it feels that Putin and Lukashenko are testing us. They are testing the international community, how far they can go without any consequences. As we speak, thousands of political prisoners are behind bars, including Nobel Peace Prize laureate Ales Belyatsky, journalist Andrzej Pochobut, activist Masha Kolesnikova, or my husband Sergei Tikhanovsky, whom my children haven't seen for 4 years already. Like many others, these people are kept incommunicado mode for years, and I don't know if my husband is alive actually. And the fate of these people directly depends on the international reaction. If it will be limited to deep condolences, and so far it looks like that, then we should prepare for more terrible news. And we mustn't allow this to happen. We must give a strong and decisive response to Lukashenko and Putin, which must include sanctions and full isolation, until all people are released and perpetrators brought to account. Dear friends, you might ask, what can the OSCE do for Belarus? First, the OSCE Assembly should make it clear that crimes of Lukashenko will not be tolerated. We need the voice in OSCE who will report on the situation on Belarus. And I propose to assign the rapporteur on Belarus or relaunch the working group on Belarus which existed in this assembly before. Second, this Sunday the regime will hold sham elections to the so-called parliament. What election can we expect when all opponents are in prison or in exile? When democratic political parties have been banned, no observers, no fair voting count, when the names of members of election commissions are now kept secret, when armed soldiers are patrolling the stations to scare and intimidate. It's rather a military operation, but not an election. And I call on OSCE not to recognize these elections, as it was done already by PACE, as it was done by the European Parliament, as it was done by representatives of more than 100 political parties in December last year. People who will be appointed to so-called parliament don't represent people, and they don't want dialogue. They see OSCE as a tribune to spread lies and justify the terror. They hope that the OSCE will close its eyes on the sham elections, pretending that everything is normal. But it's not normal, and we shouldn't pretend that it is. I call on you to exclude the newly appointed so-called Parliament of Belarus from the Parliamentary Assembly. I understand that you value and cherish dialogue here in OSCE. But do you want to have a dialogue with torturers and murderers? Lukashenko's cronies do not represent people of Belarus. OSCE PA already made the mistake of recognizing Lukashenko's pocket parliament in 2000. It happened after the dictator dismissed the real parliament and murdered its former acting speaker, Viktor Gonchar. And it's time to correct this mistake. And third, I ask you to invite representatives of Belarusian democratic movement and political parties as observers. They already participate in the work of PACE. Participation in OSCE will make the voice of Belarusians heard, and OSCE will show bravery and commitment to its own principles. You know, we live in non-conventional times, and non-conventional times need non-conventional decisions. And dear friends, let me assure you that democratic Belarus will be a cornerstone for regional stability and international security. And with your help, we will restore justice and rule of law. We will conduct free and fair elections under the supervision of OSCE, and democratically elected parliamentarians will take their seats in this room. And it's not a dream, it is a plan. And of course, it will take some time, it will take some efforts, but with your help, we will walk this path faster. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetlana. It's an incredible honor to have you here, and it must be a really incredibly difficult for you and exhausting to keep such a strong mindset for such a long time, and I thank you for that. Thank you all. Now, as we have concluded the intervention from our keynote speakers, I now look forward to hearing your views on the presentations you have heard today and on the issues before our committee. Seeing that many committee members have asked to speak, we will need to be efficient with our remaining time, and I kindly remind you to please limit your intervention to 2 minutes at most. I call first Mrs. Farah Karimi from Netherlands. Please have a floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you to our speakers for your clear and strong words about the threats against human rights defenders and journalists, with special attention to the situation in Russia and Belarus. Your insights are both clear and disturbing. Also, my thanks go to our reporter for presenting the outline of your upcoming report. I agree very much with your emphasis on the critical importance of universally respecting human rights, international law, and humanitarian law, highlighting the need to end double standards and adhere to the rulings of esteemed institutions like the International Court of Justice is vital. The ICJ's verdict requires Israel to take all necessary measures to prevent a potential genocide in Gaza. This ruling imposes a duty on all Genocide Convention signatories to actively work towards preventing such a tragedy. In your report, I would also appreciate an examination of how the OSCE participating states have responded to this verdict and their obligations under the Genocide Convention. It is particularly concerning that many have suspended their funding to UNRWA at a time when humanitarian aid is the only lifeline for Palestinians. This is especially crucial because our commitment to international law and human rights must not be conditional on political convenience. Thank you.
Thank you for respecting the time limit. And now we continue to Mr. Joe Wilson from United States of America.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for your strong Czech leadership. And I want to ask unanimous consent if we could have a moment of silence in memory of the assassination of Alex Navalny, in memory by war criminal Putin, and in memory of the assassination of Ihor Lednik by Lukashenko. Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'd like to also thank so much to be here today and see so many wonderful people. And I really appreciate Vice Chair Kandanyan of Armenia. What a wonderful visit to Armenia and to Yerevan. And again, I could almost identify everybody here how inspiring you are and how meaningful it is for me to be here. And this week has been particularly significant to me. And that is, I want to thank very much Bundestag and PA member Tobias Winkler. He arranged for, on Tuesday, a hearing, a field hearing for the U.S. delegation of the Helsinki Commission at the very important courtroom 600 in Nuremberg at the Nuremberg Courthouse. And it was to have presentations on the tragedy of the kidnapping by Putin of children from Ukraine to be taken for Russification, which is exactly what Adolf Hitler did by kidnapping children from Poland to be taken to Germany. And so it's been an extraordinary week, and I just want to thank everyone here for the hospitality, and just I want to assure too, it's bicameral, U.S. House and Senate, bipartisan, Republican, Democrat. We stand with the OSCE. Thank you very much on behalf of the people of Ukraine and Belarus.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And now we will continue to Mr. Gilles Baum from Luxembourg. Now please take your floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Chair. 2024 will not only be the year of the Olympic Games and of the European Championship in Europe, in Germany, but also be a very important year concerning elections. Half of the world's population will take part in elections in more than 60 countries this year, among those Russia, the US and India. Voters very often rely on information received via the press or the news to help them make a more informed decision. Unfortunately, members of the press and the media are more increasingly becoming targets, victims really, as they are being deterred from independent reporting by any means possible. According to Reporters Without Borders, 4 journalists have already died and 503 were being held by mid-February of this year. Also, the Human Rights Watch report 2024 mentions that governments are increasingly using technology platforms to silence critics and censor dissidents. What further assistance can we, the OSCE, provide in order to uphold elections as a transparent and fair and democratic process? Thank you.
Thank you, and I invite to the floor Mrs. Ingrid Sirsene from Latvia.
Thank you. Today we gather here as advocates for justice and democracy. The recent tragic events surrounding the untimely death of Alexei Navalny, a loyal advocate for transparency and an outspoken critic of the Russian government, serve as a reminder of the threats against democracy. The international community can't turn a blind eye to such obvious violations of fundamental values. Last October, a former Latvian MP was traveling to Kyrgyzstan to lecture at OSCE Academy in Bishkek. We must address the alarming incident involving the request to arrest Latvian politician Vyacheslav Dombrovskis on the grounds of OSCE in Kyrgyzstan by Russian authorities. This action is an obvious disregard for international norms. This MP was on the most wanted list circulated by the Russian authorities, and he managed to get out of Kyrgyzstan only by the skin of his teeth. And I would like to underline that it happened in one of the OSCE member states. This just goes to show that anyone in this room can readily become a political prisoner when traveling to a country that maintains friendly relations with Russia and blindly accepts requests from Russia to detain persons on politically motivated charges. I would like to inform you about an unpleasant situation which has recently come to light, whereby around 60 former and current Latvian MPs can't quite easily become political prisoners. Following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the Latvian parliament voted to withdraw from an agreement on preserving Russian war memorials. Russia has now put the MPs who voted yes on a most wanted list and has circulated it to its so-called friendly countries. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, please, Monsieur Didier Paris de France, have a floor.
Merci. Merci Madame la Présidente. Autorisez-moi à saluer tout particulièrement la présence courageuse et émouvante de Madame Tsikhanouskaya qui s'est exprimée précédemment. Vadim Karsko, Alexei Navalny, Igor Lednik, 3 prisonniers politiques décédés depuis le début de cette année, et il y en a sans aucun doute d'autres, soyons lucides. Alexei Navalny était le plus connu d'entre eux, il n'est pas le seul. Igor Lednik serait le 5e, voire le 7e prisonnier politique à mourir en détention en Biélorussie depuis 2021. Ils sont décédés du fait de leurs conditions de détention, d'avoir été privés des soins requis par leur état de santé ou d'autres causes totalement imputables aux États qui les détenaient. Concernant le décès d'Alexei Navalny, la France a demandé une enquête indépendante et approfondie sur la mort en détention de l'opposant russe, dont elle tient les autorités russes pour totalement et pleinement responsables. Par ailleurs, la France appelle à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle de tous les prisonniers politiques en Russie et exprime en particulier sa vive préoccupation sur l'état de santé critique de l'opposant Vladimir Kara-Murza, il ne doit en aucune façon être le prochain Navalny. Il ne s'agit pas ici que de la Fédération de Russie ou même de la Biélorussie. Il faut également agir pour obtenir la libération des prisonniers arméniens, d'anciens responsables du Haut-Karabakh, arrêtés et détenus encore actuellement par l'Azerbaïdjan. Au-delà des prisonniers politiques et à proprement parler, je voudrais rappeler l'attention sur le nombre et le sort des personnes détenues, le plus souvent pour de faux motifs, qui en fait dérangent le pouvoir ou ont été témoins de faits compromettants. Les qualifier d'agents d'étrangers, d'espions, de supposés trafiquants de drogue ne suffit pas à établir la réalité de ce qui leur est reproché et qui est validé par un tribunal fantoche systématiquement à la solde du pouvoir en place. Les qualifier d'agents étrangers, à nous maintenant de qualifier les crimes de Poutine, c'est le rôle de l'OSCE, les crimes de Loukachenko. Il s'agit de dénoncer les conditions électorales, il s'agit en réalité de dénoncer ces régimes qui font honte à l'état de droit international. Merci Madame la Présidente.
Okay. Thank you, and I ask Mr. Christian Vigenin from Bulgaria.
Thank you, Chair. Dear colleagues, I fully support the remarks made by the rapporteur Malik Ben-Ashur, who correctly outlined our priorities in the area of responsibility of this committee. I would like to underline that the fight against disinformation and false propaganda should not lead to limitations of the freedom of media. It is sometimes difficult to strike the right balance, but let us do our best to not cross the line. However, opposing efficiently the disinformation and foreign interference remains a key challenge in the area of my responsibility, Eastern Europe. We have to admit that the situation with human rights, political freedoms and independent media is deteriorating in some of the OSCE member states, especially in some of those countries. Putting aside Russia, we have seen dramatic change in one of those participating states, namely Belarus. There were times when we had hopes that the country was progressing even slowly in the right direction. I remember, for example, the autumn OSCE PA Assembly meeting that Minsk hosted 2017. Since last presidential elections, the country is drifting quickly away from the OSCE principles, priorities and strategies. The upcoming elections would mark another low point since the opposition is practically crushed. Critical voices are silenced and OSCE ODIHR is not invited to observe the so-called elections. It is very difficult at this stage for me as a special representative on Eastern Europe to define any meaningful and credible strategy for our policy to address the situation there. After a number of meetings and discussions, I see unity behind the evaluation of the situation and certain confusion about the measures we can take. I am thankful that Mrs. Tikhanovskaya is with us today and that she shared her views. I'm sure that her efforts will help us in defining such a strategy. Obviously, one of the gravest violations is the very existence, but also the treatment of the political prisoners. Therefore, I plan to put all my energy in this issue, together with my colleague Steve Cohen, who is the Special Representative on Political Prisoners, and I hope that with these efforts and commitment, we can achieve success. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now Mrs. Carina Odebrink from Sweden.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to all the speakers. I want to express my deepest condolences to the family of Alexei Navalny and to the forces working for a change and for a democratic Russia. But we cannot forget the victims of the authoritarian regime in Belarus, most recently Igor Lednik, activist and former social democrat who died in prison. So we need to address Belarus as well as Russia of the violence of human rights, repression of their people, lack of democracy, and the war on Ukraine. And it's our obligation to contribute to change with all our strength. As a rapporteur for the support team for Ukraine for human rights and democracy, I also want to emphasize the alarming deportation or kidnapping of Ukrainian children to Russia, a grave violation of internal law that cannot go unanswered. The findings from the OSCE reports on the Moscow mechanism are an obligation to all of us. We need to be strong and we need to be united. That's the only way to make a difference for the deported or kidnapped children of Ukraine and for the democratic forces in Russia and Belarus. Thank you very much.
As I cannot see Mr. Pavlo Frolov, so I invite Mrs. Pipa to speak.
Hello to everybody that are with us today in this committee. I understand the main goal that we are here to protect human rights. And I see the biggest role of OSCE like a place for conversation between 87 countries, governments and parliaments. You know that in Ukraine we have, and speak thank you a lot about it, about kidnapping, and you know that is near 20,000 children and just 400 are returned. And one of the biggest problem is, for example, what happened with these parents when child don't want to sink the Russian atom can just have a punishment, like don't give them medicaments for persons that is 13 years old and has diabetes. It is something that we must understand when we speak about human rights of children in Russia. And when we speak about execution of prisoners, like we speak a lot about Navalny that was killed in the day, I will speak about it in day of Munich Security Conference. It is something that Putin said about our society and about our goals that we can make together. And second, I want to speak about human rights defender from Ukraine, Maxim Butkevich, that are still in Russia prison, and about the 3 persons that we speak from the OSCE that are in the same prison. And when we speak about human rights and when we speak about Belarus too and prisons in Belarus too, I want to give 3 main points to everybody. First of all, to OSCE. Please, I ask you to work like you must protect own children. If you will together have a mind and emotions, you can make it and help our with this kidnapping children in Russia, with this whole prisons in Russia and Belarus, and we must do it together. Though all others delegations in the time of second big war in Ukraine, I know that you are tired, and I know that some people are burdened of the theme. But if you don't want to protect,
interrupt you. Please finish your speech.
Okay, it is that last one. I just asked to ask and remember that the best way to protect human rights today is a weapon and military decision with Russia, and it will be the same decision with Belarus. I really help you to speak in parliament and government is it, and it is like better to stop this everything in Ukraine, not spread in the Europe. Thank you.
Thank you. Please, speakers, respect the time limit. Now I ask Maria Antonio from Greece.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam President, dear esteemed ladies and gentlemen, colleagues. It's a great honor for me to present here at this session as a representative of the Hellenic Parliament. Furthermore, I feel the weight of responsibility as the President of the Special Standing Committee of the Hellenic Parliament for Youth, Equality and Human Rights. Therefore, I express deep concern and convey the apprehension of my country, Greece, regarding the precarious and alarming situation prevailing in Belarus. In a country bordering in the European Union and aspiring to become a member. Greece, as a member of the European Union, fully aligns with the following positions. We express our sorrow that political prisoners continue to be held under appalling conditions, subjected to torture and mistreatment without access to basic healthcare services, legal representation, or contact with their relatives. We suggest to immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners and their effective rehabilitation. We urgently call on the authorities of Belarus to abolish the death penalty and, as a first step, to impose a moratorium. We appeal to the authorities of Belarus to engage in genuine and inclusive dialogue with society, aiming for free and fair elections under the observation of this organization and in accordance with internationally recognized standards. We condemn Belarus' involvement in Russia's unwarranted, unjustified and illegal aggression against Ukraine. We support the efforts of democratic forces and civil society in Belarus and recognize their pro-European choice. A future democratic Belarus has a place in the European family as an independent, prosperous and peaceful country. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Antonio. And now, Susanna Camione from Italy.
Dear President, dear all, I'm a senator and a lawyer, and as a lawyer I work in courts to defend abused women. In the Senate, I'm a member of the Justice Committee and also sit in the Committee Against Femicides. We are working hard to eradicate this crime that unfortunately increases day after day, not only in Italy, but all over the world. Violence against women consists not only of domestic abuse in the family, but it also includes every type of violence a woman is forced to bear. In times of war, there is a kind of abuse consisting of terrible rapes, mutilations, and femicides perpetrated against women as war weapons. Unfortunately, we have some tragic examples of these crimes in the Red Sea conflict, as well as in the war between Russia and Ukraine. Still, these crimes are common during wars. We do not intend to tolerate this any longer. It's time to understand and stand up, telling the whole world that this horrible practice has to be considered a war weapon. It has been considered a crime against humanity and punished as such. In Rome, in the Senate, on the 9th of April, we'll hold a conference focusing on this type of violence. Members of Parliament, ministers, judges will confront this scourge all together. You are all invited to join us in supporting this battle and be part of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Pauline O'Reilly from Ireland.
Thank you, delegates. The scenes of human suffering that are being brought about by Israel's military action in Gaza are gut-wrenching to witness. Hamas' attack on Israel on October the 7th was abhorrent, and the continued holding of hostages is intolerable. But Israel's response has been indiscriminate and represents collective punishment on all Gazans. It is clear to us that war crimes have been committed. And today, the...
From Italy must turn off her microphone.
And it is clear to us that war crimes have been committed. More than 28,000 Palestinians have died so far in this conflict, and 67,000 have been injured, while 90% of the country faces acute food insecurity. Nearly 3/4 of the population are relying on contaminated water sources. We are talking about a level of death and misery hard for any of us to comprehend. And we now have a situation that after being ordered to move to the south of Gaza, Israel has begun bombing this one remaining area of shelter and is also threatening a ground invasion. Today, the Attorney General of Ireland has given our legal opinion on the practices of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territory, and we believe that it is exceeding what is necessary and proportionate in self-defence. And what can we all do as states? We have to ensure that UNRWA is fully supported financially. Ireland is giving its own financial assistance. However, ultimately, Israel must pay for the destruction that it is causing in Palestine. We also must ensure that we have an immediate and lasting ceasefire, and that all states do what they can to bring that about. We must work towards a two-state solution, and we must ensure that no state is giving assistance or aiding Israel in the breach of international law. That is quite clear. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now I will give a floor to Mrs. Timea Szabó from Hungary.
Alexei Navalny's death. Navalny was most certainly the fiercest opposition opponent of war criminal Russian President Vladimir Putin. His poisoning first, and then his imprisonment finally, his murder by Russian authorities, is one of the most outrageous events in recent history. And this comes from a country that has already launched an illegal and unprovoked war against Ukraine, killing hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and abducting over 100,000 Ukrainian children. The death of Navalny has been met with an outpouring of grief across the world and even inside Russia, honoring Navalny's memory. Yet, Vladimir Putin has not only remained silent about Navalny's death, but detained people who peacefully laid flowers on the memory of Navalny. According to human rights reports, close to 400 people were detained and arrested and beaten at custody after these peaceful events. Among the 27 EU member states, only the Hungarian government was the country that has not commented on Navalny's death. Prime Minister Viktor Orban has remained silent to this day. Shame on this behavior. So now, in the name of my country here and today, I would like to express our deepest sympathy for Navalny's death and our greatest condemnation of this vicious crime. We believe that Vladimir Putin must be held accountable for Navalny's murder. But as I said earlier, this kind of behavior will spread across Europe. Just this week, the Hungarian court has convicted 2 opposition MPs on fabricated political charges. We might actually, including us, end up in prison soon. So if we don't act together, Putin's dictatorship will be directly experienced even within the European Union. We must act together to save the Europe that we know now. Otherwise, we will lose it forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Szabó. And now, please, Mrs. Inka Hopsu from Finland have a floor.
Madam Chair, 2 years have passed since Russia's cowardice and brutal attack on Ukraine, or 10 years since the first steps of war. Yet still today Ukrainians lose their lives. Infrastructure and environment are destroyed by Russia. The frustration of Ukraine in the situation is growing more and more evident, as is unfortunately also the growing lack of interest and necessary support of some states. I urge you all to focus on delivering all necessary support to Ukraine. Dear parliamentarians, the initial proposals of the rapporteur are very welcome. In a time when fundamental values are being challenged from many directions, it is important this Assembly show a resolute and firm front in their support. Because what are the people of Ukraine fighting for? What are they risking their lives for? They want democracy, they want human rights, they want dignity, and they want a social based on rules without impunity and the power of strongest. No dictator or warlord can offer them that. Last week, we received the devastating news of the death of Alexei Navalny, a brave opponent of Putin, who was first poisoned by Russia and then sent to 30 years of prison for his political opinions. We call for a prompt, independent and impartial investigation into Navalny's death in custody. Those responsible must be punished. He is yet another political prisoner whose basic freedoms have been denied, one of thousands in OSCE participating states such as Russia, Belarus and Azerbaijan. We demand justice to Ilya Yasin, Oleg Orlov, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Sergei Tsikhanovsky and many others imprisoned for their thoughts. Calling for their release is about defending our values of democracy, human rights and rule of law, the very guarantors of peaceful nations and coexistence. The place of opposition politicians is in parliament, not in prison or in exile or in a grave. I have a message to Russia. Removing the limits of presidential mandates is against Russian constitution. A political activity excluding the opposition and free media is not called an elections at all. It's simply a political activity.
Thank you. Now I ask Mrs. Valérie Boyer from France to speak. Oh, I cannot see her here. So please, now I give a floor to Mrs. Özgül Saki from Turkey.
I think that nowadays it is almost impossible to talk about human rights without discussing about migration policies. When we look at the EU's migration policies, we see that the European civilization is rapidly moving away from human rights, ignoring the 1951 Refugee Convention and approaching migration with a purely security logic. For example, last days, the readmission agreement signed between EU and Turkey is a direct blow to the universal migration and asylum system. It is a serious violation of the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees. They have gone further and now similar agreements are on the agenda between Italy and Albania, Germany and some African countries. Britain has also introduced the Rwanda plan. This is a policy of queuing up underdeveloped countries and turning them into Europe's migrant camps through money bargains. Whereas we must share the burden of migration equally and fairly. Finally, we see that the EU remains silent on human rights violation, torture and ill treatment practice. The Turkish judiciary refusal to recognize the judgment of European Court of Human Rights as in the Demirtaş and Kavala cases. The Kurdish question. The AKP government's proactive war policy in Syria and the Middle East. The refugee negotiations cannot be used as a political bargaining. Europe should no longer be a partner in this. Europe's security lies in peace, not in a policy of war. Thank you.
Thank you for respecting the time limit. And now, please, Mr. Tural Kanyaliayev from Azerbaijan.
Thank you, Chair, dear colleagues. As we are convened here in this esteemed Committee on Democracy, Human Rights and Humanitarian Questions, I would like to draw your attention that in just a few days we will commemorate the biggest genocide, massacre, which was perpetrated against Azerbaijani civilians in 1992. On 26th of February, Armenian forces invaded and massacred more than 600 civilians, mostly elderly people, women and men, children. But this time we will commemorate this genocide, the anniversary of this genocide, in a different atmosphere, because the great return has already started in Karabakh region of Azerbaijan after the liberation of our territories, and people are going back to their homes. And in this city of Khojalı, which 32 years ago was subjected to the massacre, now people are preparing to live their lives. Dear colleagues, just also a few points I would like to say because of my colleagues before me. As to criminal charges that mentioned today with reference to my country, let us make it clear that who Armenia and others refer to are individuals who are under criminal indictment due to their involvement in serious criminal offenses, including initiating and conducting an aggressive war and acts of terrorism and committing grave breaches of international humanitarian law. Criminal liability is not determined by ethnicity, and there is no legal basis that would grant these individuals impunity. Last November, the International Court of Justice also reaffirmed the right of Azerbaijan to conduct investigative actions with regard to these persons responsible for international crimes committed in the territory of Azerbaijan. This has also confirmed that there is no evidence indicating that those persons have been arrested and detained by reason of their national or ethnic origin. I thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mr. Kyriakos Hadiani from Cyprus, take the floor.
Unfortunately, the situation in Russia and Belarus in the last 3 years has been drastically changed. The governments of these two countries have engaged in an effort to suppress all independent voices in their country, violating the most basic fundamental rights. The recent death of Alexei Navalny is not the exception in this. Navalny's death is a blow to freedom and democracy. His sudden death last week silenced the strongest voice of criticism against Russian President Putin and its authoritarian regime. We call on the Russian authorities to return his body to his relatives, carry out a full investigation into the circumstances of this death, and hold accountable those responsible. We also demand the release of all those unjustly arrested for participating in demonstrations. Similarly, according to ODIHR, another international organization, the Lukashenko regime continues to enact harsh repressions against its own people. In Belarus, individuals exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms are systematically detained, abused, and subjected to intimidation and harassment. Many of these prisoners have been held for months without contact with their lawyers and relatives, who do not know where they are today or the state of their health. Civil society organizations also face an unprecedented struggle for survival. Actually, the civil society in Belarus is dead. Apart from this, we see once again double standard to be applied to Turkey. Every year, thousands of people face arrest and prosecution for their opinions. This proves once again that the hypocrisy as regard to the respect for human rights and fundamental freedom and the rule of law. We once again call for the immediate and unconditional release of all political prisoners in Belarus. We call on the Belarusian authorities to allow diplomats and international organizations, including medical foundations, to visit political prisoners so that they can assess their condition and provide aid. And we hold an independent investigation into the death of political prisoners in custody. We urge the Belarusian authorities to fully implement their international organization and OSCE commitments.
Please finish.
Finally, I would like to commend the tireless work of civil society organizations and human rights defenders in Belarus, despite the very real dangers they face in conducting their work. Thank you very much.
So please, our next speaker and all of you respect the time limit. Now I please to take the floor Mrs. Dagbjörg Hakonardóttir from Iceland.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, speakers, dear Assembly. Today I am fortunate enough to be able to express my firm support for a remarkable woman whose courage, determination and steadfast pledge to democracy inspires millions, if not billions, around the globe, and that individual is Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya. Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, you are truly a symbol of hope for the people of Belarus in the face of adversity, standing up against tyranny and oppression with exceptional bravery. Despite facing intimidation, harassment, and even the unjust imprisonment of your husband, you have remained steadfast in your pursuit of freedom and justice for your fellow citizens. Your journey to the front of the political stage is not only a testament of power to common people to make extraordinary change, you are a feminist champion. As more males fall victims of imprisonment, their wives and children are put on the spot and are subject to threats and violence that should never be tolerated. And let us not belittle their political imprisonment and exile. As we face a new era full of uncertainty and democratic disruption, the need for world leaders like Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya is greater than ever. Leaders who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when confronted with intimidation and threats against families and children. The murder of Alexei Navalny sheds an even darker light on the situation, as well as the state of democracy in Europe. And let us never forget the unwarranted imprisonment of Sergei Tsikhanouskaya based on fabricated, politically motivated charges. Again, I am grateful to have the opportunity here today to express my solidarity, and as well as for all the people of Belarus as they continue their fight for freedom and democracy, which many of us so often take for granted. Let us never forget the power of one individual to make a change that has the potential to dismantle tyranny. The voices of the general public in Belarus must be heard, and as for myself, I pledge to listen. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to Mr. Gabor Haidu from Romania. Yes, and I cannot see him right now, so we can proceed to Mrs. Madeleine Blanquer from Belgium.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Well, colleagues, political imprisonment is unacceptable, and we should strongly condemn any regime persecuting politicians or political leaders and thwart such acts of happening. And I refer, for example, to the Catalonian independence movement, or the arrests in Poland that highlight the political turmoil between the Law and Justice Party and the pro-European coalition. But also the persecution of Christians in Nagorno-Karabakh because of their belief and affiliation with Armenia. What is happening there is not only a moral, but an ethnic and cultural cleansing orchestrated by Azerbaijan. Or what about the talks of an AfD ban in Germany? To what extent is such a debate acceptable in a democracy? Banning the fastest growing opposition party would lead to persecution and repression in the heart of Europe, as it has been happening in the south, in Spain, and in the east, Poland. The European Union, but also we as OSCE, should not ignore this and take a clear position against these kinds of repression. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I please Mr. Ravshanbek Alimov from Uzbekistan.
Madam Chair, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, there is no doubt that one of significant and fundamental condition for implementation of standards of human rights protection is creating a necessary legislative basement and for fair and transparent elections. So let me draw your attention to the ongoing comprehensive reforms being undertaken in Uzbekistan. Last September, we adopted the National Strategy Uzbekistan 2030, which outlines the country's development objectives and priorities. Those priorities include creating the stability to allow individuals to realize their fundamental rights, ensuring that economic growth benefits the well-being of the population, protecting the environment, ensuring the rule of law, and the consistent continuation of the principle that Uzbekistan will be a democratic and peace-loving state. Distinguished colleagues, the electoral system in Uzbekistan complies with the norm of international law and OSCE standards. The legislative framework guarantees freedom of choice, the right to elect and be elected. At the same time, the process of further improving electoral legislation continues on the basis of international standards and takes into account national experience of democratic elections and referendums. Last year, important political events took place in Uzbekistan. A referendum on updating the constitution in April, and early elections of President of the Republic of Uzbekistan in July. We deeply appreciate the active participation of the OSCE and all its institutions to observing these events. I would like to emphasize that in Uzbekistan, the priority given to the implementation of OSCE and ODIHR recommendations into the electoral legislation. Over the past 5 years, ODIHR has made about 30 recommendations as proposals. To date, more than 20 of them
Thank you,
have
Mr.
been
Alimov.
implemented into the national legislation. We continue our systematic work with the OSCE institution to improve the election process. We are now actively working
Please finish your
on a
speech.
draft constitutional law, which is based on OSCE standards. The significant amendments are being made to the electoral code of Uzbekistan to increase the minimum number of women in nomination of candidates by political parties from 30 to 40%. Dear colleagues, this year parliamentary elections will be held in
Please finish your speech.
updated
I urge you.
Constitution of the Republic. We are confident that the election will improve further decentralization and role of parliament. In conclusion, we reaffirm Uzbekistan's readiness for expand, deepen cooperation with OSCE Parliamentary Assembly. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I had to use all tools I have. And now, Mr. Jan Tore Sanner from Norway.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to address 2 points. One, Russia should disclose all available information concerning the death of Navalny. In the likely case that Russia will not credibly do this, an international investigation should take place. The OSCE may use its capacities for fact-finding to initiate such an investigation, either under the Moscow mechanism or by the OSCE PA appointing a special representative to report on the circumstances of Navalny's death based on all available sources. Western states should follow up by imposing targeted sanctions against those who were responsible for his death. My second point, On the background of the recent death of Alexei Navalny, I have great concerns concerning the health and security of other political prisoners in Russia and Belarus. In particular, I'm concerned about the situation of the prominent political prisoner Vladimir Kara-Murza, who has been poisoned 2 times in the past and suffers from weakened health. The OSCE should address the situation of Kara-Murza and other political prisoners with Russian authorities, demanding that their health and security be guaranteed. As MPs, we should support prisoner exchange between Russia and Western countries and ask for Kara-Murza and other Russian and Belarusian political prisoners to be included in such exchange. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I give the floor to Mrs. Ladiana Kalujerovic from Montenegro.
Dear colleagues, this is my first participation and address at the Parliamentary Assembly, and it represents special responsibility to talk about such an important topic. Today, we all stand here to shed light on the individuals who embody the courage and resilience of the human spirit, political dissidents and political prisoners. In every corner of the globe, there are brave individuals who dare to speak the truth, who refuse to accept injustice, and who fight for the rights and freedoms of all people. These political dissidents are the conscience of the society. They are the voices of dissent, challenging regimes, corrupt systems, and unjust laws. Yet, for their bravery and commitment to justice, many political dissidents find themselves persecuted by those in power. They become political prisoners, held captive for their beliefs, their words, and their actions. And what is their crime? Simply daring to demand a better world, a world where freedom, equality, and justice prevail. The matter of the political dissidents and political prisoners is particularly relevant with the OSCE, which strongly promotes human rights, democracy, and the rule of law across the participating states. As members of the parliamentary community within the OSCE, it is our responsibility to uphold the principles of democracy, human rights, and rule of law. We must stand in solidarity with political dissidents and political prisoners around the world, advocating for their release and demanding justice. We, as OSCE parliamentarians, need to join together our efforts to develop policy recommendations aimed at enhancing effective political freedom throughout the OSCE region. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And now we'll ask Mr. Pavlo Frolov from Ukraine to speak.
Madam Chair, thank you. Dear colleagues, the United Nations estimates that more than 14.6 million people, or 40% of the Ukraine's population, will need humanitarian assistance this year. This number includes 5 million IDPs who have lost everything: homes, friends, neighbors, jobs, socialization. Many of them have also lost loved ones or have been injured. As a chairman of the Special Parliamentary Commission on the IDPs' right protection in Ukrainian Parliament, together with colleagues, we try to find a swift solution for the most significant problem, the housing for IDPs. But without the assistance of your parliaments and governments, dear OSCE members, we will not be able to solve it. Because over 4 million IDPs have fully or partially damaged housing, and all our taxes, customs payments, sale of government bonds we have to spend for defense. Even more suffering experience thousands of Ukrainian civilians who became victims of torture and ill treatment, sexual violence, abduction and enforced disappearance, and other crimes conducted by Russians. Russia fails to implement its obligation under international humanitarian law by severely restricting the ICRC mandate to visit Ukrainian prisoners of war and captured civilians. Currently, 15,000 servicemen are listed as missing persons. There is no international organization in the whole world that can demonstrate a significant result in the release of captives held by Russia. Around 28,000 citizens of Ukraine can be considered missing under special circumstances. Every day the Russian occupiers detain civilians in the temporarily occupied territories, adding to this list. According to the estimates by Presidential Commissioner for Children's Rights, the Russian occupiers could have deported nearly 200,000 or 300,000 children. Out of them, almost 20,000 such cases were documented. Almost 4,500 Ukrainian kids who are orphans or lack parental care were illegally transferred. Only 536 of kidnapped children have been returned to their families. After the
I really hate to
deportation of
interrupt you,
Ukrainian
Mr. Pavlov
children, the
Frolov.
occupants continue to commit illegal acts against them, changing their citizenship, transferring them to Russian families, and rejecting their attempts to leave Russia at the border. So, to commit a crime of genocide. Our mission is
Please finish your speech.
Their suffering and bring all prisoners, all adults, all deported Ukrainian children home. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we go to Mr. Mayer Habib from France. Please, Mr. Mayer Habib from France, can you speak? Nope, okay. We can now go to Mr. Kamil Aydin from Turkey.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to raise a couple of issues in a very limited time. Initially, I would like to say that we, the parliamentarians, represent our people in our countries and make their demands and voices heard in such international platforms. In this sense, globally speaking, we have been witnessing two tragic violations. One of them is the Russian aggression in Ukraine, which has already started 10 years ago with the annexation of Ukraine. And the other one is the violations in Gaza. Of course, what happened on the 7th of October was unacceptable. And the following disproportionate violations are more unacceptable than the previous one. Secondly, I would like to emphasize that, as has been all democratic countries, powers which are independent from each other can only act in accordance with the rule of law and constitutions in particular. And according to our constitution, judicial power is exercised by the independent courts. It means that no organ, authority or person can give instructions or advices to courts. Turkey implements, therefore, the judgments of the European Court of Human Rights, and the ratio for the execution of the court's judgments by Turkey stands at 89%. This is well above the average of the whole Council of Europe members, which is 79, indicated in the reports. On the other hand, the individual applications lodged by Kavala and Demirtas with the Constitutional Court are still pending. There are many judgments of the court awaiting to be executed by other members of the Council of Europe for a considerable amount of time. It's not just to evaluate Turkey's performance by consistently picking up a couple of cases. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I invite Mrs. Irina Gerashenko to speak from Ukraine.
Thank you very much, dear colleague. Every day, Russia continues to commit crimes against humanity and perpetrates genocide against the Ukrainian people. Russia destroyed peaceful cities, schools, kindergarten, hospitals. 20,000 Ukrainian children were illegally taken to Russia. Russians show wounded soldiers in Avdiivka. This is a war crime. The entire world was shocked by the brutal murder of the Russian opposition Navalny. A week before that, Ukrainian civilian Viktor Demchenko was tortured to death in a Russian prison. At least 8,000 Ukrainians are in Russian captivity, with about 2,000 of them being civilians. Among them are medics, teachers and journalists. Bogdan Butkevich, Vladislav Yesipenko, Dmitro Heluk. They are all in grave danger. Ukrainian prisoners return home with scenes of torture. We know of cases of castration. People are subjected to torture in the occupied territories, and men are forcibly conscripted into the Russian army. Representatives on the International Committee of the Red Cross are not allowed into places of confinement in Russia. Russia must be punishment. We are grateful to the OSCE Special Committee for the productive meeting in Ukraine. The committee's work needs to be intensified to document all their crimes and unite around the fair punishment to Russia and the creation of own international tribunal. Thank you.
Thank you. And now the last speaker in our list is Mark Weezy from USA.
Thank you very much. On February the 16th, we in the United States woke up to the news of Alexei Navalny's death in a Siberian prison, where he was subject to cruel treatment for his long career of political advocacy and exposure to Vladimir Putin's corruption. Despite many arrests and one near fatal poisoning, Navalny never wavered in his condemnation of Putin's repression. And make no mistake about it, whatever the claims of Russian authorities or the exact cause of death, Navalny was murdered for his activism and for his desire to see a free and prosperous Russia. Russian authorities have still not released his body to his relatives. In this way, they are hiding the truth and adding more cruelty to this tragic murder. We grieve with Navalny's friends, his family, and all those in Russia and Ukraine who are fighting to put an end to Putin's reign. We need to bring an end to his terror. And my question today, in the wake of all we've heard and seen of Russian violence against Ukraine, of Putin's murder of his country's most prominent dissident, is how much more can we take, and how much more will we take? Putin has shown us that he has no limits to the crimes he will commit. No limits unless we insist on them and our governments impose. So no relationship with Russia is worth preserving over the lives of millions. We need to do what's right. We need to help Ukraine, and we need to stand up against Putin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weezy. And since the list of speakers has been exhausted, now I will thank you, dear colleagues, for an interesting debate. This has been a challenging topic we have tried to address today, but one that I feel strongly must remain high on our agenda. I would now ask if our keynote speakers would like to respond briefly to the debate. I cannot see. Mr. McCarthy, please have a floor.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. There were no direct questions, so that's why I hesitated a little bit, but I think many of the issues that have been raised highlight some of the most serious challenges that we face in our region when it comes to the respect of democratic principles and human rights. And what I would encourage all the members of the Parliamentary Assembly is to try to make use of the OSCE institutions, such as ODIHR, to really advance these cause. There are several ways in which we can help your Parliament with legal opinions, with more information about some of the situations that have been identified. So we stand ready, of course, to support your work and to find synergies with this committee, with the special representatives on political prisoners and all others who are interested in working with us. And of course, the bigger picture, it's about the election observation activity that we conduct together, jointly also with other international institutions. And the next years are going to be crucial to try to maintain, to preserve this tool, which has been developed by the OSCE in first place since 30 years, but which is now under serious challenge and threats by some participating states that, as you know, have not invited this year, in the last couple of months, to observe elections. So I think this is something we need to keep on our radar for the future, of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Matteo. And I heard that Madam Ambassador Kalan has something to say, so Anne-Marie, take the floor.
Thank you very much. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the OSCE PA for inviting me as chair of the Human Dimension Committee to this meeting. It was a very interesting and useful debate, and I just wanted to let you know that I will reflect this debate at our next meeting of the Human Dimension Committee. And in my national capacity, let me say that I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the leading and inspiring role that has been played by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. Her work for peaceful Belarus and her work with the Belarusian democratic movement, her commitment to the Belarusian people and their aspirations for a democratic future is really admirable, and I'd really like to thank her for her work. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Teresa Ribeiro, you want to speak, I guess. So, have a floor.
Very briefly, because the session has already been quite long. But first of all, let me join what Anne-Marie just said about Svetlana. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being a source of inspiration. And thank you also for all the work that you are doing to really restore the democratic values and freedoms in your country. So thank you very much for that. I also would like very much to call your attention for the need to join forces if we really want to protect journalists and to protect media freedom. When we are talking about media freedom, we are not just looking at media freedom as a standalone issue, but much more as a crucial pillar of our democracies and a crucial pillar of security. So if we want to have and to achieve comprehensive security, we really need to invest in media freedom. We really need to safeguard media freedom. This is very important, and you are as a legislative body, you are very important to inspire the laws in your countries, to inspire your citizens in order to mobilize them to this important fight in our democracies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa. And maybe Svetlana, you want to add some last words to our members?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for giving me this possibility to raise the issue of Belarus and the state of political prisoners in our country. I want to say thank you also to Secretary General Roberto Mantella for this year's support of our democratic movement. Thank you, every country, every parliamentarian who raised the voice for Belarus. Thank you for supporting Ukraine, of course. The only thing I want to wish all of us, let our actions be louder than our tweets. Thank you.
So I want to thank all speakers sitting here with me, and also to all of you participants and members of the committee. And I will end this debate, and I hope that we'll meet later in this evening to continue this debate a little bit informally. So see you there.